All right, so we have a test on Friday. So got that on Friday. It's over the hypothesis testing and maybe a confidence interval type of thing, like just knowing your formulas. There's like, yeah, so your typical tests, the multiple choice and severe response. So getting that down, this is the last thing in this little unit, and then next week we're going to do confidence intervals and hypothesis testing for means. So like if we were doing a sample asking people what's their average ACT score, SAT score in high school, like that would be a means problem. We've been doing proportions, so like percentage problems, but we're going to do means. So it'll be similar. There's a slight difference, but for the most part it'll be similar. All right, what we're going to do today is I want y'all to do this on this paper with the check your understanding. It's like the type 1, type 2 errors notes. So you can put this like on the important ideas. So I'm going to like tell you, explain what is a type 1 and type 2 error. So when you're, we're talking, this goes with hypothesis testing because when you're, like we're saying like, oh, I have evidence for the alternative. I do not have evidence for the alternative. Did you, I think I printed that. I put that paper there after you walked in. So when we've been like, so we've been like doing a full problem, null, alternative, and then like saying 0.084 is greater than 0.05, so I do not have convincing evidence for the alternative. And so what if this was wrong? Like what if there's a chance that we're not right? Like I don't have evidence for the alternative. What if I get it wrong? That's called an error. We say that there's no evidence that this coin is, let's say we're doing like a coin is fair or a coin is unfair. So let's say we think we have evidence, we don't have evidence that it's unfair, but then it turns out that it is. That's an error. So there's two types. You can make a not evidence error, or you can say that you do have evidence and that be wrong. So there's two types of errors that you can have. So let me do my example here. So you have a null and an alternative. The null is like always your status quo, a claim, whatever. Your alternative is your hypothesis. So let's say I'm putting them into words, like I'm just coming up with a random example because we're going to do some like word examples today. Let's say my null is that the earth is not flat. Like that's normal people. And then your alternative is that the earth is flat.
Is it on?
No, I want you to put it on the important ideas. There we go. On your other paper. Did you pick up that other one?
I only got one.
Here.
I only got like it looks like the assignment.
Yeah. When you walked in, I didn't have it out yet. Okay. So, all right. So there's two options when you do this. Like, there is either that the null is true. That's an option, right? Or there's another option that the alternative is true. Like, one of those is true. One of them's true, the other one's false, whatever. One of those statements is true. So that's like what I'm going to put. I'm going to make a little table to try and make this digestible here. Okay, so either the earth is not flat or the earth is flat. One of the two things. Okay, we can also come up with, this one over here is going to be my conclusion area. So I have two options over here. I can either say that I have no evidence. I have no evidence for the alternative, or I do have evidence for the alternative. Like when we do our work, we do our problem, those are our two options for a conclusion. You either do not have evidence for the alternative, or you do have evidence for the alternative. Okay, so let me write out in words what would happen in this box. And two of these are going to be wrong. The two of these are going to be errors, and two of these are going to be correct statements. Okay, so let's say this first one here. I decided that I did not have evidence for the alternative. Like, I did not have evidence that the earth is flat. And so what I do is I say, basically I conclude the earth is not flat. Because that's me. If I didn't have evidence for the alternative, I'm saying the null. And it turns out that the null is true. So I conclude the earth is not flat, and I'm correct. Yay. Like, that's a good conclusion. I actually did the problem correctly. Yay me. So I did not have any evidence for the alternative, and the null was true. So that's a good conclusion. Okay, let's do this one. Let's say I did watch a YouTube video, and I have evidence that the alternative is true now. Like, I believe the earth is flat. So basically I could say this. Like, I could say, believe earth is flat, but let's say in this scenario the null is true. So I fully believe, I come to a conclusion that the earth is flat, but it turns out it's not. So but it's not. So I'm a fool, basically. I'm wrong. So this right here, that's an error. You just made a mistake, right, in your conclusion. So you decided that you had evidence for the alternative, but it was wrong. Like, it was actually the earth is not flat. So what this is, this scenario when you think you have evidence for the alternative, but the null was actually true, is called a type 1, and they do it with like Roman numerals. So type 1 error. There's a type 1 and a type 2 error. So this is a type 1. So a type 1 error is when you think you have evidence for the alternative, but you were wrong. It turns out later on you find out you're wrong or whatever. So in my coin flip, this would be like, I thought the coin was unfair, but it turns out it was a fair coin or whatever. Okay, then like this one here, let's say that I decided that there was no evidence for the alternative, but it turns out the alternative is true. So let me put that into words. No evidence for the alternative means that I think the earth is not flat. So I, think earth not flat, but it is. Like, the government's lying to me and I'll never know. I'm just, under their control, under their thumb. The man's got me down. So think earth is not flat, but it is, you're being controlled. Like lied to. Like the lunar landing on the moon. We've never been to the moon. Lies. Horrible. Never believe anybody. Just kidding. Okay, so this is an error. You just made a mistake. So this is another mistake in your conclusion. So this one, when you think you have no evidence for the alternative, but it turns out the alternative was the true statement, this is a type 2 error. So Roman numeral 2.
And just like hypothetically, if it like.
Well, because like every single time we do a problem,
Are
so like let me go back to this. When I do this coin, it's either fair or unfair.
Yeah, but like, is it saying it's an error in the instance that it is true and the problem was wrong, or in the instance that we're wrong?
So this is the thing where you do your math correctly,
And we
and you come to a conclusion that you don't have evidence, but the true statement is that the alternative is true. It's just your statistical,
Like we just took the wrong-
you just made a mistake. There's always a chance you make a mistake.
Oh,
So like you remember,
And
you remember like a 95% confidence interval? So 95% confidence means that if I do many intervals, 95% of them will contain the true mean. So this means that there's like a 5% chance of all our intervals that they could be wrong. So that's like this. Like I did a good reason, but it was just one of these errors. I made an error. It can happen. It's not like I didn't, there was no bias, nothing. It was just like,
made the wrong conclusion.
there's just a chance I got it wrong. Yeah. Okay, so that's another error. And then we have one more important term. So let's say I think there's evidence for the alternative, and the alternative is true. So I know Earth is flat, and I win at life now, because it's true. The Earth is flat, and I've been convincing y'all that it is forever, and it actually is. That is the actual truth. So this is not a mistake. So this is like, you're correct. Both of these, this is a correct statement, and this is a correct statement. Like this one is, you thought the Earth is not flat, and it's not. This one is, you think the Earth is flat, and it is. But this one has a special name. So when you do the alternative, when you think the alternative and the alternative is true, so like your hypothesis is correct. Like I think the coin's unfair, and it actually is unfair. This is called power. This is called power. So I think whatever. Like my alternative is the government's chipping me out of something, and that it's unfair, and then it actually turns out that that alternative is true. That's called power. So this is a correct statement, but this one is too. This one doesn't have a name. I don't know why. Whatever. But so this is called power. These are mistakes. This is a mistake and a mistake. Just like a natural statistical like possibility that it could happen. Okay, so type 1 and type 2 error. Alright, so let's do some problems, and hopefully we'll get a little more confident on this. Okay, so this guy, teacher, purchased a trick coin, and it's supposed to land heads up 75% of the time. One of his students tests the claim, and they flip it 50 times and get heads up 35 times. So like they got a p hat, 35 out of 50 is 70%. So they did a test, and they got 70% of the time it lands heads up. Alright, so the student does a whole hypothesis test and tests it at an alpha of this. Okay, so we're not actually going to do the problem, like the mathematical thing, but they come to some conclusion. So we're going to describe what would the type 1 error and the type 2 error be in this example? So what would the type 1 error be? So type 1, and then maybe I'll write type 2 down here. Okay, so let's think about it in terms of our little grid here. So if I go back to my grid, a type 1 error, oops, don't do that. A type 1 error is when I think I have evidence for the alternative, but the null was true. So let's put that into words on this problem. So like, I think I have evidence for this, but it turns out that it's actually this. So let's see, like, I would say, I think the coin has a less than 75% chance of being heads. So let's see, I would say, or you could say let's not say think. This is like you find evidence. So you find evidence that the coin lands heads up less than 75% of the time. So like, you do your problem, you did it right, this is your conclusion, but it turns out that this null was actually true. So, but it turns out the coin really does land heads up 75% of the time. So, but the coin actually is heads 75% of the time. So basically, you think the manufacturer is lying to you, that this is like a trick coin by 75%, but it turns out like they weren't. The test just was wrong. Okay. So that's type 1 error. Oh, nice. Okay, that's a type 1 error. Type 2 is the other mistake. So the other mistake would be, thinking that there's no evidence for the alternative, but the alternative is true. So in context of this problem, it would be thinking that this is the true statement, that it truly is a trick coin, but it's not. So I'll just say it like that. So I'll say, it's like, find no evidence. So like, you actually did the problem, you found no evidence that the coin is less than 75% heads, but, so basically on this one, it's like you believe the coin, the manufacturer's claim, like you found evidence for it, but it's wrong. So found evidence that the coin, no evidence that the coin is less than 75% heads, but it actually is less than 75% heads. So these are just like the opposite statements. They're the opposite errors of each other. So it can be hard to distinguish sometimes between the two, because they're so similar, like which one's which. And so that's why I want to do, I kind of want to make it, like if you can get this grid into your mind enough and like say where the type 1 and the type 2 is and put it, then you can like straighten it out in your mind. Last year, I have one on the board back there, and I have one up here. It's like the type 1 error was like claiming you either are not pregnant or you are, and the type 1 error was like you tell someone they're pregnant but they're not, and the type 2 error was like you find evidence that they're not pregnant but they actually are. So it's like the same thing. Like I'm making an error either way, whatever way. I need to remember it. Okay, so like let's finish off this one, and then I'm gonna look at some of the problems with you as well. So which type of error would result in this guy returning the coin and writing a bad review for the product? So which one did he think he was getting gypped on, but actually wasn't? So yeah, it was the type 1. He thinks whatever. He finds evidence that the coin is less than 75%. He thinks he's getting gypped, but it turns out he's not. So like this is like the type 1 error. He like finds evidence that the manufacturer is lying to him, but turns out he's the one that there was a mistake, there was an error. Alright, and I'm going to get into the alpha. I'm going to do another problem with you, and then we're going to talk about alpha. Okay, let's do this other page, so the like assignment page. And I want to do number 2 with you first. Then I might do number 1, maybe not. So there's like 4 problems on here. So this one is like, are you innocent or are you guilty? So like in a court of law, basically. So let's state the null and alternative in words. So like, what's our null and alternative? So the null is like status quo, like there's no action taken. So like in America, the null would be that you're innocent. Like no action taken against you. That's what it is. But then we're always trying to prove, our hypothesis is always, like if you're in a trial, someone's trying to prove that you're guilty. The month of January, I watched a lot of Law and Order. It was a good month. But,
Which one?
the original, because it's on like every channel, everywhere. It's amazing. Okay, so I need to add. So this is like no evidence for the alternative. You find evidence for the alternative. That's like this little table. So this is the exact table that I like made for you. And then there's either that the null is true or the null is false, which I wrote it as the alternative is true. That's the same thing as saying the null is false. Alright, so let's see. So if you do the table the same way every time, your little errors pop up in the same spot. And this might help you remember it easier and stick it in your brain easier. So if you put no evidence, evidence, null is true, alternative true, it'll be good. Okay, so like on this, you find no evidence for the alternative. So you find no evidence that they're guilty and they're innocent. So that's good. So basically that would be, so you found no evidence of guilt. This is too small of a box. And like it was correct, and they're innocent. And they are innocent. Jeez, that's a small box. How can I make this bigger? Yes, perfect. A little better. All right. Okay. All right. So you think you're the jury, and you found enough evidence to say that this person, evidence of alternative. So you find evidence of guilt, like you think you're on the jury and you'll all convict the person guilty, but like they're not. So but they're not. So this innocent person is going to jail. So innocent going to jail. How sad. That would be terrifying. Right? Like, I didn't do it. It's like, I got framed or something. That's a little Alright. So, this right here is your type 1, that's your type 1 error. Like that's it. The jury found evidence of guilt, but you're not guilty, so you just sent an innocent person to jail or whatever. You just made a mistake. Alright, so I want to talk about something that gets brought up. This right here is your alpha. When we set an alpha level, that's what a type 1 error is. It's your alpha level. So when we say alpha of 5%, that would mean 5% of the time, there's a 5% chance that we're sending an innocent person to jail. Like, that's not. So sometimes, like maybe in this situation, we would want to use an alpha of 1%. Like, we only want 1% of the time to send an innocent person to jail. So this is like your alpha, whether you want it to be 1%, 5%, 10%, like you have to gauge what is is this a really bad thing that you don't want? So like I was thinking about the vaccine or something, like find evidence that the vaccine will help people, but it like doesn't help or whatever. This would be like an error, and so they were deciding what alpha. Do they want to make this mistake? Is it okay to make this mistake? Or is it like, do we not want it? So like in this case, they probably want like a really low alpha. You don't really want to send innocent people. But when you do that, we're going to talk about consequences over here. Like things happen to this side too. Okay, so let me put this, let's do this one. So there's no evidence for alternative, but the alternative is true. So you think the person's innocent, but it turns out they're guilty. So that would be evidence, no evidence of guilt, but they did it. So like a guilty person is going free. So this is a mistake. We obviously don't want to make this mistake either. And this is your type 2 error. If you want to do arrows, I'm fine with them. Or like if y'all don't want to write it in these tiny boxes, you can just write them down here too. And just draw an arrow up to the box. I'm good with that too. Okay, so that's your type 2 error. I just let a guilty person go free. O.J. Simpson out there running around. Okay, and then the last one is you find evidence of guilt. So evidence of guilt, too small of handwriting, evidence of guilt, and you're correct, like they are guilty. So you just sent a guilty person to jail. Yay, you. Good job. Okay, so that is your power. Alright, so I want to talk about, let me just focus on something else real quick. The main thing from this is you just need to be able to say what these are in context, distinguish between them. The second main thing from this is there might be a question on how the alpha and the power relate to each other. There might be one AP Stats question on it. So I need to go over it. So, but like, you need to know like this is type 1, this is type 2. That's like the main important thing. And this is power. But okay, let me go over like, why would we choose? Obviously we want to do the lowest alpha, but what's the effect on power? So let me draw a beautiful picture here. So what happens is when we're doing our significance tests, we have this alpha of like 5% or something. And so when we do it, we have an alpha of like 5%. Whatever. There's like our null. Okay. And then we find like a p hat of somewhere like over here. And so like what's actually happening is we find this p hat, and if we centered a graph at the p hat, it would have a specific overlap, like where the alpha hits. And so maybe just don't get lost too much in the graphs of it. So like we have this alpha of like, let's say 5%. So this is like the chance that we make an error. This is a type 1 error. All this is me making a evidence for the alternative, and the alternative is actually true. So all this green stuff right here is my power, like me making a good choice. This is me sending an innocent person to jail. This is me sending a guilty person to jail or whatever, based upon like where your p hat is. So let me just show you this. So like, maybe I need a thicker, let's do purple. Maybe that'll work. Okay, so what if I wanted to make this alpha smaller? Let's say I wanted to make this alpha, let's say I wanted to make the alpha 1%, because I don't want to send innocent people to jail. What just happened to our chunk of power? Our power just went down because our alpha like went down. So like, you will never be asked to draw this graph. I just need you to understand the idea. If I, like in this case, I want to decrease the chance of sending an innocent person to jail. But when I do that, that makes my chance, that decreases my power, so that decreases my chance of sending a guilty person to jail at the same time. So this is the idea of like a really strict jury versus a loose jury. Like if you're going to be really loose and you don't want to make a mistake, well guess what? You're probably going to like end up sending less people, guilty people to jail. More guilty people are going to go free. So you have to strike this balance. Because obviously we don't want this, but we also want justice. And so it's hard. There's like a balancing act. So that's why the alpha is like, it could be different options. You could do 1%, 5%, 10%, based upon like how much you want this and how much you want this. Okay. Another way to reduce this is by doing a bigger sample size. Makes the standard deviation go down. So like it makes these graphs, now I'm just like, it makes these graphs like tighter. So like now it's just, I had like a basketball coach in junior high, and we would do like, he would come over and he'd do a play, and he'd be like, all right, you get here and here and here and here and here, and then you pass the ball and you cut and you come over here and you cut. And so I feel like that's what I just did. Like I just did it at the end, it doesn't make any sense. So now that's what I feel like I just did. It doesn't make any sense. But like basically these work together, and if you increase it, it'll make whatever. This is not as important. I don't want you to stress about this. I want you to think about knowing these is more important. But if you get that other part, you might get a question right on the AP test. Or you could just guess. You have a 20% chance of getting it right anyway. But basically these kind of work together. So that's my idea. Okay. So type 1 error. So if I just wrote it out, so like your type 1 error, type 2 error. So type 1 is that you think you have evidence for the alternative, but the null is true. And then the type 2 is you find no evidence for the alternative, but the alternative is true. So you're making a mistake. Power is evidence for alternative, and alternative is true. Like you did the action and it was right. Okay, so just looking at this statement right here, it's harder to memorize than if you do, I think it's easier to know this picture and know where they go. It's easier to say this is a type 1, this is a type 2, if you can just get them in the right spot. Okay, so what I want y'all to do is, I want you to do number 1, 3, and 4. So on the back side there's 2 others. I want you to put them into context. Tell me what the null and alternative is. So like, write it up top in words. Give me the graph. Tell me what's what. And just point them out the difference. And then, if you haven't turned in any of your worksheets, or if you've got burning questions on any of the work part of it, because I won't see y'all until test. Well, I'm not going to be here on Friday because of golf tournament, so.
You're not.
Audrey, not going to be here on Friday.
Yeah, I'm not going to be here.
Okay.
Sorry.
I do have, but you get to, if you come, you do get a paper copy of the test. I do like, paper copies to write stuff on, but whatever. Alright, so if you got a question, let me know on anything on the unit, and I can help you out. Type 1, type 2 error, and power, just know what the definitions are. Being able to write it down.